right, this is American Beauty, episode 1, part 3, and we've been talking about trauma and anxiety, and the fact that the November 2016 elections were, and I'm so sad this word has been abused so much, but triggering for so many people. For some, it was the first time they felt so acutely panicked by a political outcome. By others, it was a very familiar experience. And we had on Suzanne Salser-Yask, and we also had on 3 academic experts. 2 of them are with us today. Very happy to have Professor Monica Kasper. She's a professor of gender studies, ethnic studies. How do I give your whole bio, Monica? You do everything. She's an associate dean. She's in charge of diversity and inclusion. Go ahead. Tell us who you are, Monica.
Okay, so I'm professor of gender and women's studies at the University of Arizona. I also am affiliated in sociology, Africana studies, and public health. And I'm the associate dean for faculty affairs and inclusion. Currently on sabbatical, and happily so, for the first time in 10 years.
And oh my goodness, congratulations! And I apologize for breaking into for non-academic listeners sabbatical. Part of the work that we do as professors is we have to come up with deep new thoughts all the time. And like a plant, you have to set a seed in dirt and let it hide before it can grow. And that's what we do during sabbatical. So we hide. So thanks for coming up.
That's exactly right.
Thanks for coming up, Professor Kasper. And then also Professor Olivia Chilcote, who is a colleague of mine at San Diego State University and assistant professor in American Indian Studies. Olivia, I'm so happy you're here.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me.
And I told both of you know, so Suzanne, I reached out to Suzanne to invite her to join this conversation, and I adore her. She's a fantastic storyteller. She gave so much in telling her own story as a Holocaust survivor for episode 1, part 1. And, she wrote back and she just said, look, I'm just not in a place where I feel like that would be good for me. She's like everyone else. She has limits and boundaries, and she's practicing good self-care. And I said, of course, I totally understand. But, I was very humbled by that. And it set in me to really thinking and deliberating about the costs of trauma and the inadequacy of most of our even well-intentioned social support structures to bear them up. And I know Suzanne's in a good place and has family and has a community around her. So she's probably one of the more fortunate people. But I had closed our conversation in the last part with, what would it look like to build our political culture, not around this kind of combative triumphalism, but around trauma, around the hard parts of our shared story. How would that change the way we go about politics? Would we be more careful with each other? I think Suzanne's not being here makes me really reflective on that question. So, Monica, Professor Kasper, what do you think? What are the costs that we carry privately because we don't have political contexts that honor these shared stories and experiences?
Yeah, I think that's such an important question. So we're in this moment, a Me Too moment, among other storytelling moments. And I think some people feel an imperative to tell. And I think that can allow people's stories to get away from them.
Yeah.
And it raises the question of who owns our stories once we put them into the world in whatever format, whether it's a podcast or a short story or flash fiction or creative nonfiction,
or tweets.
Whatever it is. Yeah, any of the above, or a tweet, right? Who owns the story and what's going to happen to the story? And I think because we're a memoir culture, we're a culture in which we have been sharing more and more and more publicly, many people. We don't always have an imperative to listen. And so sometimes people tell their stories and they just fall like a stone in the water and they create ripples, but there's no imperative or really education and support to teach people how to be better listeners of people's traumatic stories. There's a real tendency, and I have found this, I do it myself sometimes, part of a way we want to show some kind of empathy is when somebody shares something with us, we share something that's been traumatic back. And we think that we're building a kind of communication and a shared kind of a shared memory or a shared experience. And we're really not, because we're shutting down that person's ability to share their story. We're not just listening. And so I think, putting our stories out there is very risky. Joan Didion wrote that writers are always selling somebody out. So if we're putting our story in writing, we might be selling ourselves out sometimes.
That is one of the most important quotes in my life.
I know. I've used it.
Oh gosh. But go ahead.
Exactly. And we might harm our family. So one of my friends and colleagues is the writer Dorothy Allison, and she has talked quite a bit, both publicly and on our private conversations, about what it means to write so boldly and graphically about her own family, right? Whether it's Bastard Out of Carolina, which is a kind of fictionalized account of incest, or, her experience growing up white and poor in the South, what that's done to her relationships with her sisters, for example. So, there's a certain responsibility in sharing our stories at the same time that we want to get them out there. Who's going to be hurt, including ourselves? And then what do we do with that hurt as a culture and in a political moment where, there's profit in hurt. There's also, a very short attention span for people's suffering.
Yeah.
We want to move on to the next thing. So I think they're really important questions. Having a good support network is a start, but I don't think it's enough.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm really reflecting on it. I mean, it's I recognize so much of what you've described as being part of our political culture. I mean, and part of the way media and media formats drive our attention into one spot and then drive our attention into the next spot. And it's a benefit to learn about traumatic experiences, especially ones that we have some culpability in as American citizens that are happening right now. And yet how does one adequately respond or hold space for all of these truths is not clear to me. Yeah, Professor Chilka, Olivia, what do we need to know? What kind of questions do we need to be asking ourselves? And this is a tough question about what it would take to build a culture that's capable of hearing, holding, and sustaining even through trauma. I mean, what can you share from your study? I'm not asking your experience necessarily, but from your study of California Indian communities, which have been truly fragmented, how are spaces created and held in community?
That's a really good question. I mean, just building on what was just being discussed, I mean, one of the first things that came to my mind was, the fact that a lot of Native people and a lot of tribal people actually don't, choose not to overshare certain things about our culture and our history because it has been, so extracted from our communities for so long. And, I was just thinking of the work of Professor Audra Simpson, who's a Mohawk scholar. And in her most recent book, Mohawk Interrupted, she talks about this concept of ethnographic refusal and this methodology that she uses and that I also use in my work because I work with my own tribe. So part of it is, this political act of not telling everything. So, instead of oversharing, it's kind of like being selective and not putting out the whole story to the world because it is a response to that extraction of knowledge and material culture that has so affected Native American people, Indigenous peoples across the world. So I think that, that's just something really important to think of is, why do some people not share? And, what is that in response to?
Yeah, that's very powerful observation. I thought about the writing of Sherman Alexie, who has written time and time again about his experience, but only in the most recent book, and I know that book was a subject of some controversy in connection with #MeToo issues, but only in the most recent book did he disclose the reality of sexual abuse in his community when he was a kid. And he's talked about his childhood throughout his career. And it's only come up in like the 15th book, And that's very telling. And I think too, to what you were saying about exploitation, when in the 19th century, when escaped, when formerly enslaved African-American people went on lecture tour or went on circuit to lecture with abolitionists, they would often be asked to bare their backs to the audience to show the scars as sort of a legend, as sort of to authenticate their testimony. And in doing that, that was another way of really exploiting a Black body to satisfy an audience that was not in an equal power dynamic with them. And so I wonder, what can be done? I like this idea of selective telling. If I would have had the opportunity to redo with Suzanne, because she's told her story before to, archives and to Steven Spielberg's documentary project on the Holocaust, and there is an ethical imperative in Judaism to bear witness and to tell so that history is not forgotten. But I wonder, how could even I'm not afraid to kind of reflect on my own methods as a scholar, as a writer, as a podcaster, set it up so that that story could be held in a space that was less difficult, even for Suzanne. Monica, what do you think? I'm actually asking you to critique my work right now.
Well, I have,
my feelings will be hurt. I am not fragile.
I know. Well, I have similar ethical conundrums, right? As an ethnographer and as a scholar who looks at women's health and women's, painful experiences. When do we tell stories? How do we tell stories? I think I mentioned, Joanna, early on in our conversations that the book I'm writing on this part of my sabbatical is on infant mortality, particularly in communities of color. Yeah. And I made a conscious decision after making some progress on that book to redo how I'm telling the story, partly because I didn't want to abstract the issue in the same way that I think the conversation about rates does, infant mortality rates. But I also made a decision not to talk to women who have lost babies. And that came about, from several years of research on things like breast cancer, women's experiences of breast cancer, women's experiences of various kinds of reproductive losses. I think that I don't want to be the person who's digging into their grief. So the way I've been able to present the story and the narrative that I'm using in the book is I've been on Facebook pages or, in groups where women have shared their own stories there, where they're already available. There are memoirs, there are, other spaces to find representations of the women's stories. Now, the flip side of that is I'm going to write a book that doesn't actually include interviews with any women themselves. So people in my field, which is sociology, are going to say, gosh, this is a limited project because she didn't interview women who've lost babies. So, there are trade-offs, right, in terms of how we want to narrate a story, how we want to push someone to share their tale, for what purpose. We want them to tell us something. And I don't know that having women's stories in the format of the book as I'm writing it would make it better or worse. It would make it different, right? And maybe there are other ways that can be useful to those women who have lost babies. Right. So, a lot of us wrestle with these questions. I do work on campus around gender-based violence, right, with the new consortium that we've set up. And earlier I did the podcast on the consortium, and we had a really meaty conversation about the politics of reporting, right? So, some victims, survivors don't want to report, some do. What are the mechanisms of reporting, and what is the mandate of reporting? And what does it mean for us as faculty, who are often mandatory reporters, to be in that position of then being essentially institutionally coerced, right, by the federal government and our own universities to share somebody's story, right, about something that's happened to them, even when they're not ready to share it themselves. Right. So the politics are cultural; they're also institutional. In lots of circumstances, they're legal. Yeah. Yeah. And it's a lot to wrestle with. So Professor Chilko, Olivia has a lot to teach us all about, selective ethnography and also selective autoethnography, because I'm aware of the ways, underrepresented people of color are put on the spot. Tell us your story. Tell us everything. So Olivia, how would you approach the challenge of, creating spaces and doing media around issues that need attention in a way that doesn't re-traumatize?
I think that, part of it, I think, is just, asking whoever it may be that, before you actually maybe interview them or whatever, like what they feel comfortable with, if they want to have some kind of ownership over, what ends up being done with the quote unquote data that is potentially used. What ethically do they want, the other party to maybe sustain the relationship somehow? Is there anything that that other person can do to give back to the community or to that person individually? I think that some of those are definitely, good practices or just things to think about when approaching, talking about difficult topics with someone else.
And let's take this because we've been talking like academics. So everyone who's not an academic who's been listening this is how we talk amongst ourselves. But there's a political dimension here too. This is the real heavy lift. What would it mean to reorient our politics to a model where there was actually be feasible for people with this important wealth of experience, people who have seen the underside of our political systems and how they fail and how they exclude, and who are in a position to warn? How do we create space in the din and the noise for these voices to be heard? All I can see in my head is it doesn't matter whether the person is wearing red or blue. The optics are always the same. There's somebody up in front of a crowded hall, and there's people standing behind them, sometimes making faces, and there's flags and there's posters, and the loud ones win. The loud ones always win. And I would love a political break from that. We've seen women leaders who emphasize listening, and progressive men transform into men leaders too. Have we ever seen political leaders in our own time and in our own, nation or, states, regions, tribes who've behaved that way? What does that look like? What would it look like to have a listening leader who created spaces for others to provide wisdom? Dream out loud. Have we ever seen anyone, Monica? Do you think? Have we ever seen like a responsively listening political figure?
Yeah, it's a good question. Not a specialist in American or global politics. I'm trying to, running through my head of all the leaders that we're aware of. I certainly think we have institutional leaders who've been capable of that.
Yeah.
I've worked, for some of them. I know, there are, and they're not always women, but there are people who are able to hear the people around them and adjust their practices. And I think if we're talking about a workspace or even a political space, what we want is not just someone who says, as Bill Clinton did, "I feel your pain,"
right?
And he connected with people in those ways, but then actually made substantive legislative and, federal changes that impact people's lives. I worry a little bit that because and I'm acutely aware of Olivia's comments about Indigenous folks, so the "we" is in scare quotes here, but we have a culture that has become predominantly very confessional, with the explosion of memoirs, with a kind of expectation that candidates will share everything and be very transparent about their experiences and their histories, but there's a politic attached to those histories, right? So we know, from watching the presidential race, women are judged more harshly than men about their particular life experiences. We know that some experiences make people uncomfortable. We have a local candidate here in Tucson, Victoria Steele, who's a friend and a colleague, who has been open on the campaign trail about having been victimized sexually. So what does that look like in the political arena? And I think it's really tough in the age of not just media, but hashtag activism, where one hashtag is supposed to represent, sort of everybody's experiences, to be able to share something about yourself in an authentic way and to have that responded to authentically. So there will be people who respond authentically and with care, and who will listen. But then again, the story gets picked up and taken in different places. And I think the risk, particularly for people with less power, whoever those might be on the margins, is that their stories will get taken up in ways that harm them eventually and get flipped around so that we don't respond with a kind of empathy. We respond with either a kind of leering sort of, just this, gosh, she shared that and it's really inappropriate, or, there's a kind of hierarchy of what we're supposed to share, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Olivia, Professor Chilko, from the communities you study, from the histories you know, can you give us examples of leaders who do better in terms of that balance Monica is talking about between, the political overshare that might create solidarity, but also, just respectfully holding space for the weight and significance of the shared histories in silence.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, of course, every, tribe and tribal culture is different, but I think that, one of the things would be, in a lot of tribes, there's, an understanding of listening to people from all walks of life. So, either really leaning on elders, but then also the youth, to really acknowledge that youth have a valid perspective also. But then, and going just beyond people is to think about our non-human relatives as well, and listening to, the land, the water, the sky, and, animals and, those relatives to us as well, because I think that that's really important and a way of kind of getting a more, holistic sort of perspective on what's going on and what's affecting, our immediate communities and, just the world around us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking too, I love that about, listening to A, creating a space for listening, and B, welcoming in and redefine, perspectives from across the age spectrum, and welcoming in other forms of observation as a kind of listening. And as you were speaking, Olivia, I was thinking about, maybe even instances in our own political culture in U.S. political culture, again, in scare quotes, of new dynamics in speaking and listening. And I think first of the moments that Emma Gonzalez held for silence in that the Parkland shooting, school shooting survivors movement at the rally in Washington, D.C. last spring, how she held the silence and made everyone hold the silence with her and labeled that as the length of time in which so many lives had been lost. And it really created a very powerful dynamic that I think is worthy of reflection, as a very different kind of political speech. And I think, too, of the Say Her Name movement, the movement to the way at many political events, a speaker will cue the audience to say the names of those whose lives have been lost as African-American women, especially, to state violence, to police violence, so that it's not just the speaker gives away and asks the community to fill in spaces with not stories, because the stories are all the same. They're just brutality, but with names that help us feel the weight of the loss. I think there's two examples maybe of how we can do it differently. And then, leading us into the final minutes of our conversation, the question of anxiety, because, it's so, one of the things I've been thinking about a lot with this episode is how it's created so much anxiety, so much powerlessness, to a feeling of powerlessness, even though we all have tremendous capacity for leadership and organizing, for people to witness the election and all that has followed, and to sort of go home and be alone and sit with it, and or to chat about it nervously on Facebook, and to not get much deeper than, gosh, this is horrifying. In most instances, there hasn't been this space to connect to how what we're seeing isn't special. It's just the coming to surface of deep historical patterns that have always shaped the U.S. So, does it make you less anxious to be a scholar or to be someone who knows the longer historical pattern than if you didn't? What do you think, Professor Casper? Does that question make sense? Would you rather know or not know? Does it make you less anxious?
Gosh, just a complicated question for somebody who's experienced anxiety for most of my life. I find that knowing helps. So having some knowledge, having some sense of patterns has helped in thinking through my own experiences of anxiety and those of others when they've shared them with me. I think the other thing that helps me is, partly being a sociologist, is thinking about Durkheim's, really pioneering work, and then others on suicide as social, and thinking about all of our mental health issues as social, even though we consider them individual. We respond to them individually through psychotherapy or drugs or whatever the case may be. So if we think that these are social expressions of some deep shifts in our culture and our collective consciousness, then that helps me think about better ways to intervene and to think, okay, if all the kids now, and it does seem to be so many of the kids are showing up at school with massive levels of anxiety,
Yep.
what do we need to be doing differently? I don't think it's enough just to teach them mindfulness, although I appreciate that work. I think we have to think structurally and think about, kind of really redoing how we think about the educational system, how we think about how our children are responding to the political environment right now. And I think the other thing that's helped me, and this came from a dear friend who is married to my graduate school mentor and, terrific friend Adele Clark. Her husband is a psychoanalyst. So of course I've had 25 years of essentially free psychoanalysis every time we're, we're together.
Fantastic.
But one thing Alan has said to me several times, we've had a lot of conversations about anxiety. And he shared something probably, now 15 years ago or even longer, and said, what if you thought of your anxiety not as a warning signal, which of course that's how we interpret it, right? Anxiety sort of being triggered, right? We sort of go back into our PTSD mode, but what if you saw it as an opportunity? That every time you're feeling anxiety about something, it's an opening to thinking about, what is the anxiety about? Is it something that you might actually want? Is it a kind of anticipation, right? To sort of try to interrupt the sense that the anxiety is always bad, even though it's uncomfortable. And so I've tried to use that in my own practice of, anxiety management, which is, as probably both of you know, is a kind of daily practice, right? If you have anxiety, particularly trauma related, it's a lifelong project. And you have to figure out ways to kind of survive and navigate. But thinking of it more in terms of opportunity than connecting it back to that social piece makes me think, okay, we have collective anxiety. What are we going to do about it structurally and collectively? What is the opportunity here to think about people's stories, to harnessing this kind of both anxiety and rage that I think a lot of folks rightly have, particularly women and women of color right now. How do we do that? I think that is actually exciting to think about rather than just depressing, right? To harness it and to think about next steps.
Right. I agree. And I think I'm so glad you brought up Durkheim. That's Emile Durkheim. He's a French sociologist from the early 20th century. And the idea, it's not in your head that you're having anxiety doesn't mean you're broken. It means that you've lived through some stuff. It's not just you. You're not broken. It's not that you're sick. It's that the world is difficult and you're well and you're responding as a healthy human being with a sense of dignity and boundaries to a world that is very, very difficult, especially for women of color and in many ways for white women as well. And that kind of brings me home. I want to give you the last word, Olivia. And it made me think of the post I see on Instagram sometimes when I follow some of the Indigenous women artists and activists who post beautiful content every day. And the one who posted, I forget who it was, someone posted a picture. It said, someone wearing a t-shirt that said, go smudge yourself, and the idea that when people do terrible things to Indigenous people or to others in their community, it reflects on their unhealth, not on the lack of health or lack of value of Indigenous people. And the idea of smudging yourself, like, go handle your mess. You're a mess. Turning around these narratives of trauma and not making them about, just our own anxiety, but that they're an indictment. The fact that so many of us are anxious and traumatized is an indictment. So you get the last word, Professor Chilcote. How do we carry this in such a way? We just tell us how to turn the ship around. It's all on you, Olivia. You got it.
No pressure. Well, I think it's, again, just thinking to your original question, I feel better in knowing that this is, part of a longer history, that there has been, a lot of really negative things that have happened in this country's history and even before this country existed. And I think that's part of it, is being, a Native a Native woman, is seeing the resiliency of my community,
Yes.
of my friends, and my family, and other, people who I've met along the way. And, there are days, and I also struggle with anxiety and see a therapist, and but I also, talk to my mom, and she really helps me put a lot of, just everything into perspective. And some of those days where I feel like, hopeless or, get that sense of powerlessness or what can I do, just talking to her and hearing stories about my ancestors and other, women in our family is just, it's really empowering. And it makes me feel like, I can get, they made it through and they struggled, and, they instilled within us, this sense that we can carry on and have that sense of resiliency, and know that, we need to do what we can to make things better in the moment in which we live in, but also to think of the future, generations equally, and to, just really reflect on what we can do and how those who came before us have, influenced who we are today, and just, try and take steps to think about that, longer trajectory, and to do, like with the go smudge yourself. I think that it's, there are those types of things that we do need to do, and just take moments to do what we can spiritually, and, in whatever way that means to each person, to, just take that time and take that space, because there will be, there will be something else that will come, and we can, hopefully find that resiliency within each other.
I love it. That was a brilliant answer to the most difficult question ever about turning the whole ship around. That is awesome. And hopeful, right? I mean, I would rather be in challenge and be able to name it and see it than to be lost. And I think the anxiety is often a reflection of rootlessness and lack of confidence that this isn't just us. We're not failing. It's something else will come, and we just need to develop the resilience. I love that, Olivia. Thank you both so much for just a really wonderful conversation. I'm very grateful to you. So thank you.
Thank you, Joanna.
Yeah, thank you.
Maybe I'm a poor girl.
I want to give a special thank you to our sponsors, our cross-promotional sponsors of this episode, University of Minnesota Press, publishers of Professor Kathy Schlindweil's book on Cambodian genocide and resilience, and also to Haven Tree. They are sponsors of the American Beauty Podcast and providers of subscription boxes for politically informed self-care. So check them out on our website, AmericanBeautyPodcast.org. Thank you.
Know that I'll be still.